Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye, and welcome back to our series, Service of the Heart. And we are building the case for the service of the heart, how it developed in exile, the importance in the life of the believer. We kind of established last time how the men of the Great Assembly began to structure it in a more formalized way, but how it was a service that was going to be the glue that held the community together in exile in the diaspora. And so we've talked a little bit about that. We're going to kind of continue on with this theme. And in the first group of this first slide that I have is just kind of going to reiterate a little bit what we talked last time, but that the service was basically designed as congregational. It was meant to hold the community together. Remember, they don't have a temple, they're in exile. This was the way to sort of formalize and bring them together. It also, as the men of the Great Assembly were working, introduced the concept of worship into the home. Up until that time, worship obviously had taken place in the temple. And it was the foundation of the Institute of the Synagogue. So the synagogue developed as a result of the diaspora and because they were in exile. And it was a way, again, to keep the community together. They're basically, at this point, under King Nebuchadnezzar, they're in Babylon. It begins to develop. The key was always to keep the hearts and minds of Israel focused on the temple, the central institution of the temple, the place in which the community came together and was instructed through the offerings and the ceremonies and the service on how to approach God, their King. And certainly we want to see this develop in our own lives. And the pattern is repeated over and over again as they go into exile and back in the land and back in exile, etc. And I do believe this is an important aspect on bringing together the whole commonwealth of Israel. And certainly in this time we have seen the development and the exercise of the studying the Torah portions, but there has been some resistance in the area of in the services. And a lot of that's just because it's confusing and frustrating and people don't really understand it. And so I would just encourage you at least to understand the historical value of it and maybe slowly begin to implement some of those things in your life. Basically, it's just a way to restore the community. Now, one of the things that happened after their return, we see that Moshe began to be read every Shabbat. So we have a picture here of one of the synagogues in Israel where we had the seat of Moses. And so the institution of prayer really spread in the context of the synagogue. And as I said, it was designed that every Shabbat Moshe should be read. And the synagogue was the place where that would happen. And so it was part of the practice really for public worship. And within the context of the synagogue, things then did become more public when they returned back to the land. And so what happens when they return is we have the temple standing and we have the development of the synagogue, and they're both sort of developing side by side, if you will, and things are switching off between the temple and the synagogue. Things that are in the synagogue now come into the temple, things that are in the temple now come into the synagogue. And I think that you could probably expect the same thing to happen again. The synagogue service in the Jewish community has developed, obviously, over these past millennia. And then once the temple's rebuilt, some of what's been in the synagogue will return into the temple and sort of vice versa. The synagogue as an institution is really developing over the centuries, from really starting with the time in Babylon, but by the time they return to the land, the synagogue service is really strong. And you can see it, obviously, it is the vehicle through where Yeshua speaks as he goes around Israel to speak to various congregations and to teach. This was sort of the itinerant rabbis had a place to go. And then we see out in the empire, in the various places in the Roman Empire, from Egypt to Rome and into Turkey and Asia Minor, all the different places where there were synagogues. This was the vehicle that Rav Shaul or Paul was able to use as he went around to teach. So it was an important institution that developed already before the next diaspora. God has a way of preparing us if we would just appreciate what He does in advance. So the synagogues are already in place. Now we know it wasn't very long, probably about 110 of the Common Era, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. And there was a great division between the believers in Yeshua and the synagogue itself, and kind of went off in different directions. However, we are seeing, I think, now kind of a beginning of a restoration of that. But it has been the thing that has kept the Jewish people together after the diaspora in 70 Common Era. The synagogues and the service has kept that people group together for the time when they returned back to the land again in 1948, essentially, when Israel was declared a state. So I think that is really a critical point in all this, and it continued to grow over the last 2,000 years, but always in the heart of the service was to fix the people, to point the people back to the time when the temple would be rebuilt. Now, over the centuries, we've seen over the last 2,000 years, perhaps, many, and probably the Jewish community, may not have cared whether the temple was rebuilt, especially because they didn't even live in the land of Israel. But that's really, and even just in the last few years, there's really been a transformation in that regard. Certainly 1967, they took Jerusalem, they took over the Temple Mount for 3 days. Moshe and Diane gave it back. But, and at that time, some obviously had kept that light alive in their hearts. But initially in Israel, people were really that all concerned about whether the temple was rebuilt or not. But that's really changed really in the last year or so, and we see this sort of on a worldwide basis. People are much more interested in temple things, in the services, in the rebuilding. Certainly those that are interested in prophecy have a fascination with it. So something's beginning to change. At the same time, as I said, prayers began to develop in the home. And the key in all that was the Shabbat. That was the ceremony that really was in the context of the home. And we see this service has sort of its own flavor, and but the offerings of the temple are instituted into the Shabbat services in the home, and we see these things developing, and they continue to develop, and more and more services actually function in the home. But Shabbat was the most important and probably the easiest one to do. The table in the home at Shabbat, at the time of Shabbat, really becomes the altar for the slaughtered animals, if you will. So various parts of the service of Shabbat correspond to the temple. So that would be a good area for study if you want to see how the Shabbat service connects to the temple itself. Again, the Siddur means set order. That's all it means. And so it was the structure of prayer. And it was basically the set order of prayer. It's the same word that we see, those of you who have celebrated Passover, the Seder, it's the same root word, Siddur, it's the set order of the Passover. And it is said that the prayer book, the Siddur, is the longest continuous record of the history, philosophy, literature, and culture of the Jewish people. So it is very important. And if you really want to learn and understand more about the Jewish people, you will find that in the prayer book. It's amazing to me how long it has survived and how important it is. And if nothing else, if you can just appreciate just reading through it until you can kind of sort out the various prayers. So let's just reiterate here I have a couple of points, that it's the longest continuous record of the Jewish people. It is not the work of one man or one body or one age, but that it grew gradually over many centuries. And it has been described as the greatest product of Jewish genius. Okay, so that's quite remarkable. And it is considered absolutely essential for the observant Jew, certainly in the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox community. It also now, as it's developed, covers the entire life cycle of the Jewish people. So today within it is the liturgy that covers every aspect of Jewish life. And as I said, it relates to the entire life cycle of the people. So deals with the fundamentals of their faith. We're talking death and marriage and birth and everything that goes in between. The Siddur covers every aspect of that. Now, it also contains selections from the Torah, from the writings, and from the prophets, as well as from the Mishnah and the Talmud. And so it's a treasury and a summary in a lot of ways of the life cycle of the Jewish people. So all those aspects are in there. If you want to study the Torah, you want to study the prophets or the writings in more detail, start with and choose portions that are actually from the Siddur. Why did they take that portion from the Haftorah? Why did they take that portion from the prophets and insert it for this prayer at this time? There's a reason for all of it. They didn't just sort of haphazardly insert prayers because they thought it was a good idea, but they all connect to one another. So perhaps take one of those, a prayer that's from the portion in Isaiah or something, and just study it and see what is its connection, why did they choose it, how does that make a difference. This is a quote from Pirkei Avot, from Pirkei Avot 2:18. It says, "When you pray, make not your prayer into fixed form." Now this is where we get into a lot of controversy, I suppose, because people think the whole thing is so dogmatic and so fixed and so formulated, and you can't go outside the form, and you're just sort of locked in this rigid thing. And that's really not the intention of it at all. It's intended to be a structure, but you are certainly free to move around in that structure. For me personally, as I pray through the Amidah prayers, for instance, the prayer for healing, I will actually take the opportunity to pray for people who need healing at that time. So don't let it's not designed to constrict you and prevent you from expressing yourself to God. It's just the vehicle to draw closer. Initially it really wasn't all that fixed, and the men of the Great Assembly discouraged it from becoming too formalized and too strict, but as everything over time, things end up that way. Now here's a couple of other points to make. This is what they saw about the Siddur, that it had real and lasting and irreplaceable value. And that even without completely understanding it, which is the place a lot of us are in, we recognize that we are participating in something holy. And this is very true. Just reading it, sometimes just letting it wash over you, the prayers that are in the Siddur, it can really transform you, and you don't know how and you don't know why. That the formula of the prayers, if you will, can kindle and strengthen and really purify, quote, religious life. I don't want to get too stuck in that structure, but it can really purify our walk with the Lord. And go on to say that prescribed prayer acts as a spiritual lever to raise the spiritual life of the community. Again, this is its design, and as I mentioned, to strengthen and purify religious life, but it helps raise up the spiritual community. Everything is structured and designed in relationship to God and our relationship to Him. Here's another quote. "One must not underestimate what the regular order of worship and fixed prayer must have meant to the ordinary man, and what this infusion of everyday life with the thought of God must have meant to the community." So kind of let that settle in. We cannot underestimate this, that it has a profound effect on the community, and I believe it can have a profound effect on our community today. Here's a quote from the Talmud, Berachot 24b. "The prayers were instituted to correspond with the sacrifices." So that's key. We can't offer up animals. We don't have a structure. That design is not there. So the prayers were instituted to correspond to those offerings. And so each one of those offerings, it's a good idea to study the various offerings, the thank offering, the guilt offering, the sin offering, etc. What was it about that offering? What is God trying to communicate about that offering to us? What about that offering can kind of transform us? What spiritual or practical application can we make? And so think about that in the context of prayers, that it is the offerings substituted for the prayer, the prayers were the substitute for the offering service. Again, the service was designed to be the glue that would hold them together over many millennia as they faced exile and separation and even death. And the connection to the sacrifices can't be overstated. Now, we will find that early on in the first century, moving into the second century, almost even to the third, elements can be found even in Christian services. So there is a divide that begins to take place as Judaism goes off into one direction and Christianity another. But the original services, Christian, quote, services, really had as their foundation the Jewish prayer service. So we find elements in that. Initially, the Christian services were completely dominated by the Jewish liturgy. And we find also that the early Christian liturgy was modeled on synagogue practices. So it started out there, and you can kind of see that in the structure of Christian service today, that when you go in terms of how they would do the singing and the reading and the homily and various things. There is a little bit of vestige left over of what the service once was. It says that Christian prayers after 300 of the Common Era are still Jewish in form and content. And as I just mentioned, things like reading the scripture, the prayer, the Amidah prayer, and the singing of psalms. So really early, whether we'll admit it or not, early Christian liturgy was modeled off of the synagogue service. So, and over time, of course, there are still elements there today, but unfortunately, a lot of Christians don't really know that that's where those elements came from. One example of this would be the Kiddushah in the early Christian service. The setting apart is when we formally, for instance, set apart the Sabbath and we drink the wine and say the blessing, the Hagafen. And this was actually a major part of the early Christian service. And also continued with the introductory formula to the Amidah. That was a major part of early Christian service as well. Now we're going to change gears just a little bit because I want to establish the importance of the central institution and how this is still the service of the heart is sort of the way in which we express that. This is probably one of the most important passages in terms of building the temple, and that's from Exodus 25:8. And it says, "They shall make for me a sanctuary." In Hebrew, it's the temple really, but in Hebrew it's the mikdash, "and I will dwell," the word there is shakan, to dwell, "in their midst. Like everything that I show you," and we continue, "the design of the tabernacle, mishkan, and the design or tavnit, which is the pattern, of all its vessels, and so shall you do." Now, from the Babylonian Talmud, the Ta'an, the Gemara, it says that really the concept of the tabernacle and the temple, those two words are interchangeable. So we see the tabernacle as kind of the temporary structure constructed at the bottom of the mountain, and then we see the temple as the permanent structure constructed at the top of the mountain. And we'll go to the tabernacle. In Hebrew is the Mishkan. And it says that God dwelled among them. Again, this was at the bottom of the mountain. And in my opinion, sort of the tabernacle represented a picture of the presence of God in this sort of present age in which we live. Remember, Moshe goes to the top of the mountain, Mount Sinai, and there he dwells with God in the cloud, and when God pours out the Torah to Moshe. And so the visual is of the temporary at the bottom, the permanent at the top, and sort of Moshe entering into the cloud or entering into the presence of God. Eventually, the temple will be, again, at the top of the mountain on Mount Moriah, and eventually all the people will be able to enter in. The people could not because they were at the bottom of Mount Sinai. They were not allowed to touch the mountain or go up the mountain. But then God has a mountain, Mount Moriah, where the temple will be built on top, where everybody will be able to enter in. And to my mind, the temple, the permanent status of the temple represents the time in the world to come, a physical representation of what the temple in heaven, if you will, would look like, or the temple outside of time. and the tabernacle being sort of the temporary temple on this earth. Now the word there for the pattern in Hebrew is tavnit. In Hebrew, in the root, you can actually see the concept of to build. Bana is the root inside that word, tavnit. So it basically means a design or a pattern. It's essentially a model for building something. Again, the root of this word is bana, to build. And the services themselves are part of the pattern, part of the structure. They're part of the model. They are part of what's being built. And this was said to be a standing commandment in every generation. So every generation was to build. And so because it's the place of the presence of God, and it's the place that teaches us and allows us to approach Him. So in every generation was to build. And so the services in the diaspora were connected very closely to the temple. So even though there wasn't a physical temple, the services were being built and designed and structured as a way to enter in and approach God in this time. So that word for bana is also a root you can hear, ben, which is son. And that word sort of means the continuing of the house. Ben is the sons are the way the house continues, the continuing seed of the house, if you will. But the concept of sons and building has in it the idea of this continuing to build a house. Certainly, we recognize it as a spiritual house, all the sons of God, but it's also talking about a physical house at the same time. This is very much this is a Hebrew concept and a little bit foreign to us in Western circles. Again, the services were God's design. And we see the priest going to enter into the Holy of Holies to apply the blood. But the ceremonies and the services are part of that pattern and model for building the temple and the tabernacle. So with a tent in a family, you would, as the family grew, you had to add on tent panels. And so that the house could grow, and sons were the way the house grew. And this house we're talking about is the permanent house, the eternal house, and it has to grow as well. The services were considered to be eternal and part of that building, part of that construction and growing of the house physically and spiritually was connected. Again, this idea of building a sanctuary was a standing commandment that was to be carried out in every generation. And the whole idea was dedicating it to God Himself. It's His service, not ours. It's not man's design, it's God's design. And certainly God gives man the tools to build, but the design is His. And I think we need to keep that present before us. Here's a verse from Chronicles that kind of helps sum this up. 1 Chronicles 28:11. Then David gave Solomon his son the designs, also the designs for everything that had been given by the Spirit, for the areas set aside for the Kohanim, the priests, and the Leviim, for the work involved in the service of the house of Adonai. So here we see, even in Chronicles here, this is carried out. Now David is given all the designs of the temple and all the services and the structure and how everything's made, and the furniture and the ceremonies and the whole design of the priesthood, and everything was given to David by the Spirit. Of course, he was not able to build the temple, but Solomon, his son, took that which was given to David and he constructed the temple, and then, of course, the services and everything went forth from there. So all of this was part of, if you will, the service of the heart. And so this service of the house is where everything functioned. And the more you learn about it, the more you begin to understand the ceremonies. And we have a photo here of what would be the first temple. The more you understand about the vessels and the furniture and the offerings, really the better off you will be. If you consider this word for service in Hebrew is avodah, and we translate it work, but it's exactly the same word that was used for Adam when he was in the garden. When he worked the garden, he actually served the garden, and it really is our first example of the word service in terms of the temple, because really the garden was the first temple, and it functioned in the same way. And Adam served it just as a priest would serve or work the temple precincts. And really the service of God is, it's really considered to be the doorway, the gate to commune with Him. And this is really, isn't this how we describe prayer? So let's just look quickly. Well, we probably don't have enough time, but next time we're going to go into a little more detail here about the avodah and the gate of God and the service of the heart. In fact, we see with the gate of heaven when Yaakov was lying on his pillows that were stone, and a ladder was erected between heaven and earth, and the angels were ascending and descending. This is sort of a representation then of that connection, that communion between God, between man and God. And so prayer and the service of God was seen just kind of like a ladder as well. So we'll pick it up here next time. We'll talk about more about the service of God. See you then. Shalom.